Ladies and gentlemen, the PlayStation 6 and Next Generation Xbox are already in their early design and bring up stages, and I have to tell you guys, from what I'm hearing about these next generation consoles, the leap that we're going to be seeing is perhaps one of the biggest that we've seen in quite a number of console generations. As you probably gathered in this video, I want to talk to you guys about some of these early things that I've been hearing. Surfshark VPN is a browser extension and mobile app that enables you to effortlessly change your virtual location and are the sponsor of today's video. You can use this tool to protect your privacy on public Wi-Fi, add an extra degree of security, or change your geolocation to watch your favorite Netflix episodes. As you know, many websites hold content to ransom based on your geographic location, and if you're traveling and watching a show on a streaming service, it might just not be available in your holiday destination. Or perhaps you're traveling and want local news from back home. Or perhaps there's simply a movie you want to watch from a different location not available in your home region. With 3,200 plus servers in over 100 countries, you'll find a server to suit your needs no matter where you go. This means you'll never be without your favorite show, and you'll never not be protected online. For those of you who are concerned about security, Surfshark VPN offers a strict no-logs policy. This guarantees that your information will never be collected. Thanks to GPS spoofing, the app can even trick other Android apps that are a little too interested in your whereabouts. This also is great if you're connecting to services on a public Wi-Fi connection if you're on the move, just to give you that extra sense of security if you're doing, let's say, financial transactions. Plus, Surfshark even offers unlimited devices under just a single subscription. You can share your accounts with friends and family at no extra cost, letting the people you care about be protected online without costing them the earth. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee with 24/7 support, and you can try Surfshark without risk and unlock the next level of browsing and security without any worry. Just click the link in the video description and enter the promo code REDGAMINGTECH, that's REDGAMINGTECH, one word, for a Black Friday special offer of 5 extra months for free with the Surfshark One package. Thanks again to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video. And if you look at the transition from the previous generation to, of course, this generation for a moment, we can probably get some idea of where Sony and Microsoft are going to be going. Now, we'll talk about this more extensively in a moment, but let's just quickly look at the history. So, the x86 processor architecture was used in the PS4 and Xbox One in the form of Jaguar. Basically speaking, these were low-power CPUs, which were really designed more for the likes of tablets. Zen 2, of course, was the transition that Sony as well as Microsoft went for with the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles. We also saw, well, really fast SSDs. Now, of course, this did mean that loading times were reduced and that type of stuff, but it also meant seamless transitions for worlds and just really, I think at this stage, we're still not 100% fully leveraging what either console's SSD can really do. And it's going to take a while, of course, for developers to really bring even this generation of consoles to, well, fully be unleashed. The other major thing that Sony and Microsoft really wanted to double down on was, of course, more realistic graphics. This is always what happens. And, well, one of the ways they did that, of course, was ray tracing. Now, both are using basically AMD's RDNA 2 implementation of ray tracing, which is certainly not as performant as what we currently have for PCs with NVIDIA's RTX 40, for example, but it does allow much more realistic shadows and lighting for games where, of course, it's used. This allows much more, well, realistic and grounded looking visuals. So let's move on to the next generation. Now, of course, we are talking about hardware which has not been released yet, so it's very possible some plans would change, and this is particularly true with Microsoft. Now, I'm sure most of you guys will know that with the whole thing of the Activision Blizzard acquisition, there were a lot of documents that were leaked, and one of those, of course, were, well, some next generation plans from Microsoft themselves. Now, Sony as well as Microsoft are given a lot of heads up to AMD's roadmap. Both companies, again, it seems, are going to be leveraging AMD, and it's no surprise given, of course, AMD has a pretty robust roadmap going forward with a ton of very intriguing technologies. Sure, CPU and GPU is one of them, but also a lot of packaging stuff, and we're going to be talking more about that and cache stuff later on in the video, I promise you guys. So, Microsoft's own documents seem to indicate that the company were going to launch later on, probably 27, 28, and it was going to be leveraging Zen 6 for its CPU technology and RDNA 5 for its GPU technology. Now, from what I'm hearing, these plans, and Phil Spencer himself has kind of hinted this, have actually changed a little bit. I'm hearing that Microsoft may launch earlier. Now, I don't have an exact release date. For example, I don't think it's, I can't tell you guys it's going to be the 5th of November 2026 or something like that, but I am hearing that plans have shifted to be earlier. And I've been told by a couple of people now that there is apparently a SoC, an APU, a chip, which is being worked on, and it seems to be Zen 5 based and RDNA 5, so the latter part still seems to be the case. Microsoft will be heavily pushing things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. We'll get more about that as well in the Sony section, so I'll hold off on that for a second. Now, what I cannot be certain of is whether Microsoft are going dual SKU. I've dug into a lot of sources, and so far I can only find out about one APU. I can't tell you guys the exact specifications, for example, the number of workgroup processors, but I am told the basic IPs. So far, though, again, I'm only told one variant exists. Now, there are three possibilities. One is that my source is simply wrong, and that's certainly possible. Two, they are working on the higher tier product first, and then they're going to basically reduce. And AMD and other companies do this quite a lot. They basically work on the flagship, and then they can just simply shave down the number of compute units, caches, whatever they need to do for the lower end variants. Another possibility is that Microsoft are going to just go streaming only for its lower tier offering. And I think this may make the most sense for a couple of reasons. For one, you may recall that there were a lot of rumors that Microsoft would be releasing a streaming-only console for this generation. In fact, Phil Spencer commented and actually confirmed that this was the case, but they couldn't get the bill of materials to be cheap enough to really make it worth it over the Xbox Series consoles. So, I think by that point, given there's just so many different options, they could go ARM, they could go x86, and again, it's streaming, it doesn't need to have a ton of power in it. I think that, again, if we look at the actual slide from Microsoft, they mention specifically that there is a light OS variant which is under $100. So I think that that could be definitely a logical thing that Microsoft could be doing with the next generation consoles, and it would also, of course, somewhat alleviate a lot of the frustrations that developers had with the Xbox Series S and X having dual SKUs early on, because it's just a lot of extra work for developers, especially when they're actually trying to get used to the architecture of a new generation of consoles anyway. And this is particularly true because when obviously you're transitioning from one generation to another, a lot of companies simply don't want to abandon the previous generation. So for example, if you're targeting Xbox hardware, you can have the situation where you would have to target like Xbox Series S, Xbox Series X, and Nextbox Series S as well as X, and that's just a lot of work. Now I want to move on to the PlayStation 6 in just a second, but I'm still getting a lot of DMs and questions regarding the PlayStation 5 Pro. I'm not going to spend too long on this and go over the specifications again, because quite frankly I've gone over them so many times and I'm not really hearing any difference in terms of the specifications. Again, it's based on RDNA 3-ish with a Zen 2 CPU, which is going to have some modest clock frequency increases and 16 gigabytes of RAM. You can see the specs on screen. But to my understanding, it's still launching. I've spoken to Tom Henderson from Insider Gaming, and he's also leaked a lot about the PS5. We've spoken a lot in DM. I'm not going to go over the entire conversation because, I don't think he'd want me to do that. But from what I'm hearing and from what he's hearing, it's still on. That is the console itself. The PS5 Pro still seems to be launching late next year. The only possible thing that could scupper it potentially is a new head of Sony. Jim Ryan is leaving, but I don't think that's going to be the case. At this point, the research and development has been done for this thing. Like, the actual console bring-up started before the PS5 original model launched, to my understanding. So it's like, unless Jim Ryan's successor really doesn't like the system, or there is an absolutely massive catastrophic issue with the hardware, which, for example, third-party or first-party developers discover, I don't see it being cancelled, so I think it's probably going to launch. And again, this makes sense because from everything I'm hearing, 2027 or possibly 2028, there's that period, the PlayStation 6 is going to hit the store shelves. So one thing I've already spoken about with the PlayStation 6, and I'll just go over it really briefly again in case you missed the previous video, and that is that Sony seems to be working a lot on generative AI, machine learning, and just in general artificial intelligence. A developer has specifically told me that Sony have reached out and asked them about this. And again, there is also those documents from Microsoft which hints that Microsoft too are going to be focused a lot on this. Now that's not really a surprise. AI, generative, stuff is just everywhere at the moment. Now a really good example of this would be the Nvidia Ramen Shop demo. I would encourage you guys to do a bit of Googling on that. You can check the entire full video out yourself. It's really interesting. It basically leverages natural language, and it's still really early at this stage. Like, this stuff has been, it's really in the infancy of how this can be leveraged. But a really good example of this, and simply an example, it's certainly not perhaps, the only way this could be used, is imagine you're playing a game like, for example, The Last of Us, and you were to say to your partner, I need to be covered because I'm going to flank. And, in theory anyway, if this stuff got advanced enough, your AI partner would be able to kind of understand, roughly speaking, what you're going to be doing. And again, there seems to be a lot of research there seems to be a lot of support in the industry. We've seen Take-Two Interactive Strauss Zelnick mention the stuff previously. We've also seen folks over at Sony talk about this as well. And some of it is also in relation to what it can help studios with in terms of the design and creation process. But as well, I believe that this is going to be very, very impactful for games going forward and the next generation of Grand Theft Auto or Last of Us or whatever titles you can imagine. And you can imagine how a company like Sony, who have just so many, narrative experiences and, single-player games, could really leverage this type of technology to make games much more immersive. And obviously, at the end of the day, that's kind of what it's all about. It's about interactivity. It's about characters, NPCs, just being more engaged in the world itself, just kind of having a more interactive feel to it. As of the time I'm recording this, I don't think Sony have settled on a graphics or a CPU IP. Now, again, they do seem to be focused on AMD being their partner. I think they may have spoken to some other companies, for example, probably Nvidia, thrown in their hat into the ring and so on and so on. But realistically, AMD have just been an excellent partner in the past. Now, of course, when it comes to graphics IP, for example, there is so much customization that Sony or these companies do anyway. It's not exactly a like-for-like comparison between a PC and a console because, again, they just customize things based upon what they need for their specific vision. But I don't think a specific variant of technology has been 100% decided on by Sony. The APU, again, does seem to be a little bit behind where Microsoft's is, because, again, they are launching their console, from what I understand anyway, later than what Microsoft are. A couple of my really good sources, however, are indicating that Sony may go a chiplet type of design for the PlayStation 6. Now, there are some patents already from Sony which do kind of lend itself to a chiplet design. However, those are not specifically for, let's say, a PlayStation 6. The patents, at least the ones that I've seen anyway, perhaps there's another one that I just haven't noticed yet, but all of the ones that I've seen anyway in public seem to be for, like, cloud. Basically speaking, and, cutting a lot of the technical jargon out, when you have like a number of gamers who are connecting to the cloud, basically speaking, those gamers will be allocated a specific amount of resources, of course. So if you're playing a PS5 game on the cloud, obviously for that PS5 game to work, it expects a certain amount of compute performance, a certain amount of RAM, etc., etc. So basically, as users dynamically connect and disconnect based on, their gaming experiences, obviously Sony want to make sure that those GPUs and so on are leveraged as effectively as possible. So that seems to be the patterns that we've seen so far from Sony. However, what we do know, of course, is that AMD are working on various chiplet-based designs for its graphics. MI300 is a great example for the data center, but that's not quite the same thing as gaming. For gaming, I've already leaked quite extensively that RDNA 4 was originally going to have a chiplet type of design, basically multiple GCDs, that basically multiple compute dies, which were essentially going to be tied together on a base tile. And then those in turn were going to be connected to things like the Infinity Cache and etc, etc, etc. Those were basically canned. And now it's all on RDNA 5. Now there are a couple of reasons that this happened. Basically stuff just kind of started to be held back by AMD and they needed to put more resources onto RDNA 5 to be competitive with NVIDIA. But of course, that is definitely something that we could see Sony employ. And in fact, a source has specifically told me that there seems to be some type of chiplet-based cache that Sony are considering utilizing on the PlayStation 6. Now, it's possible that this type of cache is somehow unified. From what I'm hearing anyway, this is kind of a really big focus for Sony, having some type of unified cache design for its CPU and GPU. And if you look at what Sony have done in terms of their caches in the past, they've always done a lot of work. For example, on the PS4, we saw volatile bit. Now, this, of course, is on the actual L2 of the GPU. Mark Cerny spoke about this, I believe the interview was initially Gamma Sutra, but basically he spoke about that volatile bit was basically marking a bit of data that is for compute in the GPU's L2, so it can basically just be better managed when when you're dealing with compute and graphics workloads. And then you had the PlayStation 5 with, of course, the cache scrubbers. Now, cache management is nothing new. Cache management is really important, but Sony's basically is quite advanced, and again, it basically makes sure that data for the cache is evicted when necessary or updated when necessary, and the developers don't really need to do as much manual work, which is a really big thing. So I suspect that Sony are going to really want to double down on this, because the most likely type of memory used for the PlayStation 6 as well as the next generation Xbox is probably going to be GDDR7. Now, we know this based upon public roadmaps that GDDR7 is going to almost certainly be used for the next generation. NVIDIA GPUs have already leaked a lot of that, as well as RDNA 5. Again, I've leaked some of that previously as well. So, with the timings, GDDR7 for the consoles makes a lot of sense. The problem is with GDDR latencies, it can be not ideal necessarily for CPUs, because basically there's the bandwidth, which is basically raw throughput, versus latency. And latency is basically how quickly you respond. It's not quite the same thing, but you can kind of think of it as like, I suppose almost like 0 to 60 versus the top speed of a car, right? So like, how fast can your car get to, let's say, 60 miles an hour, but then what's the top speed? And you can have a car that gets to like 60 real fast, but its top speed isn't necessarily as fast as another car. You guys get the idea. And this is something that is very important for CPUs, because they are not as parallel in terms of their workloads as a CPU. So having a cache which is basically there to like try to mitigate the trips to memory is really important. Now, I am missing a lot of technical details here because I don't want to get super in the weeds with this stuff, because the video is already getting kind of lengthy, but that is certainly something I've heard, that Sony want to work on some type of large cache, which is basically going to essentially just change the way that developers kind of deal with stuff, especially compute and mixed CPU and GPU workloads. And we've already got some hints of what's, what we're kind of seeing with this anyway, with various APUs going forward from AMD. But of course, it's going to be significantly different with a console. I'll also add, actually, because I'm just reading my script notes, Chips and Cheese, which is a really interesting blog if you're very technically inclined. I would encourage you guys to check it out. Basically, they did some testing on different workloads, compute, for example, CPU versus GPU. And again, this is not necessarily raw performance, but the latency of how workloads are affected. And again, when you're dealing with a CPU, you have like the setup. So the CPU essentially sends the work to the GPU, and then the GPU essentially does that work. And when you're dealing with compute commands and all that stuff, and there is a lot of very interesting stuff going forward. Microsoft, for example, have really kind of already let the cat out of the bag in some of these aspects with, what's the word I'm looking for? Work graphs. And basically that's where the GPU can essentially create a lot of the work itself. So it basically spawns more work, and it basically means there's less, or should I say fewer, trips to the CPU, where the CPU has to generate less work so the GPU can do a lot more of that. And of course, we've seen a lot of this stuff just as a whole, you know, on the graphics pipeline at this point. You know, the whole thing is starting to change a lot, and there's a lot of really interesting moving pieces out there. There's a couple of things also I've been hearing, but I don't necessarily want to say them in this video because I'm still trying to verify some stuff. With most of this information, I've at least had a couple of sources tell me roughly similar things, so it's kind of a good indicator of what's being worked on. And while I have spoken about this in the past, I'll just mention it here. So Sony, of course, have been doing a lot of work with ray tracing anyway. Obviously, Microsoft have as well with DXR. But ultimately, there have been a couple of very interesting things with Sony. So there have been a very interesting conference that was made public, was more of a presentation. There was basically a ray tracing reconstruction. Now, NVIDIA have been doing a lot of research on this as well. And we've seen, like, for example, DLSS 3.5 with ray tracing reconstruction. And basically that uses AI/machine learning to essentially fill in the gaps, if you will, because when you're doing ray tracing, it basically uses, well, samples. So you're basically shooting out crap tons of rays into the scene based on camera position. So you shoot a ray into the scene from the perspective of the camera, and then essentially it figures out what stuff the rays of light will interact with. So obviously some things will reflect light, some will, well, just, you know, it's going into space, so essentially it doesn't do anything. The ray of light just goes off screen. In some cases it will absorb it, etc, etc, etc. However, to do that, it's very computationally expensive. So when you have ray tracing reconstruction, this is a big thing that Sony already spoken about in this conference. It seems to be mostly film focused, but they also spoke about it at the PlayStation, you know, logo, and they mentioned specifically gaming. To reiterate, I'm hearing that this is going to be a really big focus going forward with the PS6. The PS5 Pro, of course, will improve ray tracing performance, as I've spoken about in previous videos. However, the PS6, I'm hearing, you know, real-time path tracing is possibly going to be, you know, not uncommon in games. Now, obviously, that's going to be game dependent. Just like not every game now uses ray tracing, so you can't expect every, you know, launch game, for example, to be fully path traced. That's not realistic, and developers are certainly going to have time to work with the hardware. But I think certain titles are really going to be leveraging this extensively. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of this works. Personally, I'm mostly interested in the generative AI thing, because I think the interactivity in games, just in general, how things like... there's a very interesting documentary actually from Valve, and I would encourage you guys to check it out if you're interested in game development. And he was talking about, Gabe Newell was talking about the development of Half-Life, and he was saying that when you are playing, for example, Half-Life, and the world doesn't interact or recognize something you've done, for example, you shoot the wall, and let's say there's no damage to the wall, there's no, like, damage, like, for example, you know, a gunshot being registered, or a barrel doesn't explode, or whatever, you are almost being insulted as a player. Like, well, you know what, your activities don't really matter in the world. And nothing has been more immersion breaking for me than, let's say, playing a game like Grand Theft Auto, and you're going like 100, and then you like crash into like a little picket fence, and it just does nothing. Like, you just don't barrel through it, your car just stops. And I think that, you know, that type of level of interactivity is something that we're going to really be seeing. Much more realistic characters, of course, in games. So, yeah. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. There's going to be a couple of very interesting videos popping up, on the channel. There's going to be a couple of very interesting updates that I've heard about RDNA 4 and Zen 5. I was going to do that today, but I was just trying to verify something for the architecture info for RDNA 4. So I think at this point I'm pretty certain on what I'm going to report, so that's probably going to be tomorrow-ish if I had to take a guesstimate. So of course, do check that out. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.